Alan, you joined the BBC in 1955, I think it was, and now you're treasurer of the association. That's a huge length of time you've had connection with the BBC. What was it like when you started?
Of course, I started when I was just 16, straight out of school, and I found it a very, very formal place. We all addressed each other by Mr. or Mrs. or Miss, or even just surnames.
That's interesting, because in production it was all Christian names.
Well, it spread eventually to our areas of the world, and they started talking Christian names. Wow, I think it was probably about 10 years after I joined in the 60s.
Maybe production was like that in those days too.
Yeah. We'd heard that, as you do, America, it was all on Christian terms, Christian name terms there. And I suppose it's one of those things, again, that spread across the Atlantic to us all.
Absolutely. Now, you spent virtually the whole of your career dealing with the commercial side of the BBC, which is extremely interesting, and I think most people don't know anything about that. Is it possible to tell us a bit about how that started? When did the BBC started selling programmes or selling books, that kind of thing?
Well, to my knowledge, it started whilst I was in the finance division, probably in the late 50s. The odd thing was that it started its life in Bush House because it was deemed to be an overseas activity. And I wasn't part of it then. I just heard of it. And they were selling basic things like Z cars and those sort of things. They had a lot of trouble clearing rights, of course, because this is brand new to Equity and the musicians as well.
So they were selling programmes to other broadcasters, is that?
Yes, but very selectively. They mostly were to the Commonwealth. In fact, I'd narrow it down even just to Australia and New Zealand. There weren't that many going elsewhere. They were just sold in groups of 6 episodes or 13 episodes, how many happened to be in that series.
But was this done as a commercial activity, or was it, as it were, goodwill gesture to the Commonwealth?
I think it was a goodwill gesture with, there might be some money to be had here. But as I say, it was before I even got involved. It was just a hearsay. The only area that I did get involved in was, of course, paying the artists their fees for the sales of those programmes. But that was just another add-on activity of my job when I was in programme or television accounts.
So artists would be paid for their originations, and then if you sold the programmes abroad, you'd negotiate another fee for them?
Yes. Mostly it was done initially through Equity, and there was a one-off payment, like a repeat fee it was really, a percentage of the original fees that the artists were paid.
Sure. Now, you started off in West 1, I imagine, and presumably you had access to all the BBC clubs and restaurants and things. What were they like?
Oh, yeah, it was quite fun, really. I joined with another guy who was about the same age as me, and we teamed up together and used to go out for lunchtime. For instance, Broadcasting House had at least 3 canteens, I believe. One down in Aeolian Hall, which was a really ornate building in Bond Street. Aeolian Hall was a studio, a public studio area where the BBC owned it or rented it, and they recorded all the old comedy shows like Round the Horn and
The Goon shows and things,
Archie Andrews and...
Right.
All those things, the Goons. That was one of the canteens that we used to go to. There was one in Yalding House, where the music department was, and publications, 35 Malvern High Street, and they were all good restaurants. And of
Plenty
course,
of pubs near Broadcasting House where the talent would go and drink after programmes.
Yes.
I imagine you went to those.
The George was one, a pub called the George. A lot of the artists used to go to. But a lot of them used to go to the BBC Club, of course, and that started life in Chandos Street, which was tucked away, again, a couple of 100 yards from Broadcasting House. And they had an area in the Langham as well, which of course was formerly a hotel. Then it became a BBC building shared by the Metal Box Company. And then, of course, in years past, it reverted to a commercial hotel, which it is today.
Yes, I remember it, and it was in the 60s and 70s and the 80s, and it was really pretty run down, frankly.
Yes, it was. The old central heating pipes were cracking and popping, and bits of paint falling off them. To get to the upper floors, they had a commissionaire that operated the lifts, which cranked its way up through the ironwork, eventually getting to the top floor of about 5 or 6 floors, I think it was.
I remember him. He had to guess exactly where the lift would end up. So
that's right.
It stopped at the point that he decided, rather than automatically.
It was pretty dodgy because you either jumped out or you tripped out, depending on the level of the bottom of the lift to the floor that you'd arrived on.
Now, the BBC clubs were virtually everywhere.
Yes, they were. Certainly there was a big one there. There was one in Bush House, which of course had another restaurant as well, which I believe was one of the best. And then in the West London, of course, there was Television Centre and Lime Grove, not forgetting Lime Grove.
Now, they've nearly all gone. I think they virtually have all gone.
Yes.
But of course, in those days, everyone drank quite a lot and smoked, of course.
They certainly did, and quite often you saw the after effects in the afternoon, where people who weren't so productive in their work.
Well, the productive bit was probably at lunchtime.
Yes, that is true. I was always told that most of the business is done in the clubs.
Absolutely. You were dealing with sort of BBC Finance, sort of internal transactions, were you, between
departments? Yes, I was dealing with, well, they were external payments, but they were mostly essential things like water rates and the equivalent of council tax now, general rates. I used to deal with all the regions and areas as well as programmes paying premises in the regions. I can name nearly all the buildings in the regions, in the cities of Manchester, Birmingham and Cardiff and Bristol.
Dickinson Road Studios in Manchester?
Oh yeah, Dickinson Road, yes. Peterhouse in Manchester. The Birmingham one was Pebble Mill, of course, Pebble Mill Studios, so that was early on, but that's gone now. They're now broadcasting from a shopping precinct.
Were you dealing, though, with production money?
No, in the early days, finance division was broken down into various departments, representing each service, radio, television, engineering and salaries and so on. We paid all the fees, for example, to artists for appearance on radio. In that case, I was in radio, paying radio fees and repeat fees to artists, as well as invoices from suppliers.
So you would know what top-rate artists were actually being paid?
Oh, I might have done, but I can't even remember them now. But many of the fees were in guineas and not in pounds.
How very gentlemanly.
Yes.
And then you moved towards the more commercial side of the BBC with what became BBC Enterprises, is that right?
Yes, it's had several names. It was BBC Television Enterprises, then BBC Radio and Television Enterprises, and then just plain BBC Enterprises.
Tell us about that relationship between the commercial arm and the BBC itself. I mean, how did it work?
To start with, BBC Enterprises were funded by television. This is quite interesting because I said earlier that there were programmes being supplied, selective programmes to selective countries overseas. They were making a bit of a profit, gross profit. And, one has to remember there are always costs in trying to get these organisations in to work. So there were other costs, overheads, etc. But in those days, the early days, there was a sign of a gross profit being made. And enterprises then moved in and took over with the agreement of the various directorates that television should control the commercial activities of radio and television exploitation in terms of recordings, that is, and merchandising. Initially, it was funded by the television budgets. That's how it happened. And then it was not really making any profit until, I would say, in the late 60s. I moved over in my finance capacity to the finance section of Radio and Television Enterprises, or BBC Enterprises, and it wasn't showing any profit at all until one year, which was probably about 68, in my final accounts, which I'd prepared for the management in enterprises, it showed a profit. And there was a great scuffle and disbelief that we'd actually made a profit. And it wasn't much. It was literally only a few thousand. It wasn't in its hundreds or tens of thousands even. It was just almost just beyond break even. So there was a proof somewhere that it was working, and gradually it expanded from there. Enterprises got more daring, got more staff, more clearances with the artists. That was the big problem, of course, and you can't just take a program and sell it without permissions. And the permissions were mostly acquired from Equity and Musicians Union, the Writers Guild, and various other organisations that spoke on behalf of the contributors. So all that had to be cleared, and it was quite, in those days, very elementary kind of arithmetic, but it was percentages here and percentages there. A lot of it was based on what the countries could afford to pay, or what the size of their population compared with the population of the UK, in order that they could work out the ratio between the fees that were paid in the UK and the fees that could be due for sales, say, in Australia and New Zealand. It wouldn't be the same as you would be charging for sales in Bermuda or the Caribbean somewhere, anyway.
But this was sales of television programmes that presumably had to be shipped out as film or tape.
Oh, yes.
But you were beginning to sell in the UK in BBC shops.
I'm talking, yes, about sales of programmes, which is and always the main purpose of enterprises, of course, is programme selling or licensing. The selling to shops, I think you're referring to records and videos, books which enterprises weren't responsible for. The books were always in the domain of BBC publications.
Yes, but you began selling things, as it were, in shops. I mean,
yes, well, yes, that
usually
moves
program spin-offs like jigsaws and fluffy toys and things like that.
Yeah, that's right. Well, the merchandising of Doctor Who and children's programs in particular, Play School and Play Away, all those sort of items were sold or licensed to manufacturers. And it did quite well, actually, those areas. But the area that I became more interested in was my record career. BBC Records had got started. I assisted in setting up the organisation for that whilst I was still in Enterprises. And BBC Records was part of Enterprises, by the way. So I got to know the structure of BBC Records fairly straightforwardly, and after about 4 or 5 years, the top job became available, and I applied for it like one does in the BBC. Went for my board, and I was very pleased to be selected. That's how I got into BBC Records, and yes, we sold commercial records of theme music and LPs into shops, with various degrees of success, and different pressures from different departments in the BBC wanting their pet products to be published and issued as a record. I did have at one time people leaning on me to issue more classical music, which we would have loved to have done. But the cost of issuing a 100-piece symphony orchestra recording was prohibitive, really, and even the record industry found that. There was one instance where Alasdair Milne, when he was Director General, he was particularly interested in bagpipes, of course. And there was a bagpipe champion, and he wanted that put out on record so it could be sold in the shops. I chuckle because I think you could understand there probably wouldn't be too many takers for that. And to set up a recording of that nature, not necessarily just a recording because the recordings might have been available, but to set up printing sleeves and labels and getting pressings done would be too costly to do that. We actually did, because who says no to the Director General? But on the other hand, then we had enormous successes in some places, like the theme music from a series, Ki Mai, the soundtrack of a programme series called The Life and Times of David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister, of course, in the 1914s or around about that time. It was a very charming piece of music, and the producer chose that to be his theme music. We picked it up because people were inquiring about it. This is often how it worked. And we issued it in record form, and wow, it took off and got to number 2 in the charts. And we sold over 500,000 copies. I've got a gold record here in my office hanging on the wall now of that particular event.
Obviously, the commercial side of the BBC started very tentatively and slowly, and it was largely to do with selling programmes overseas to other broadcasters, gradually increasing the domestic sales, records and so on. And I agree that publications was separate. But then it slowly began to get bigger and bigger, didn't it? I mean, about the mid-80s, of course, you got the BBC Micro coming along, and that was quite controversial, because why should the BBC be selling a commercial computer? And with all the issues of competition and so on. Presumably that there was very little objection when things were very simple and low level, but when you've got something like that, people began to, I suppose, question whether the BBC should be doing this sort of thing.
Well, yes, there's always been the critics. I think in the record business, for instance, as I've mentioned before, we had an advantage because we liaised with the production departments to see what programmes were coming up and so on, and what music they were going to use and whether it was commercially possible to release. And of course we had all that inside knowledge, and of course the record industry itself said, well, this is not fair. We don't get that opportunity. Our argument is that we're making a programme, and all the bits and pieces that go with the programme, like whether it be in the form of dolls or bricks or whatever toys might be made, why not produce music as well? Music was quite an attractive thing to remind people of the programmes, and that's what we did. And I think it was a very sound argument that it was enhancing the enjoyment of viewers and listeners to be able to obtain add-ons to the programme.
Yes, so it was always related to the programmes and so on.
Yes.
But I mean, Enterprises now, or BBC Worldwide as it became, or BBC Studios as it is now a huge business.
Yes, it is. In fact, one of the biggest channels in America now is a channel called UK America. And, so many thousands of people listen or tune into that, not just listen, of course they view it. Funnily enough, I was watching a programme the other night on Netflix. I don't know how this happened, but on the wall of this particular set and scene, a logo with UK America on it. So obviously it's almost like seeing CBS or NBC, it's almost become like that.
Yes.
and that popular.
But of course, one forgets that the BBC was pretty flush with money in the 60s and 70s because of the increase in the colour licence fee.
That's right.
And people buying colour televisions, and the money kept pouring in. And then that was really a very good time. But obviously, as the BBC got more and more squeezed of money, the commercial side became and has become much more important.
Yes, it had. Originally, we used to set up co-productions with the BBC. Enterprises used to advance cash into the programme budgets even before they started selling them. And it's similar now, the way it works with independent productions. BBC will put money into independent productions and then share the rights afterwards and share the profits from that. And that used to go back into the BBC as well.
Now, I know that you had a lot of dealings with the Palace on a number of occasions in your, and also some trips abroad.
Yes.
So you must tell us about those.
Perhaps I start with the Palace because they were quite fun, really. When I was in BBC Transcription Service, that is part of the BBC World Service, based in Kensington House in West 14, and I say West 12 because it's only a stone's throw from Shepherd's Bush. One of our projects was to try and get Prince Charles to re-record an earlier recording which he'd made for Jackanory of a story that he himself wrote called The Old Man of Lochnagar. The Palace just put us off for a long time. The reason we couldn't use the Jackanory is because in technical terms it wasn't up to the audio standards that we wanted for the sound quality of the records that we used to distribute in transcription service. We used to distribute ordinary LPs just like you would buy in the shops in transcription. Cut the acetates and the lacquer and so on, and then get them off and process them. And we used to distribute, that's how we used to distribute the BBC programmes. So the quality really wasn't good enough, that soundtrack. So we wanted to re-record it. And then one day we had a letter from the Palace saying His Royal Highness would like to re-record that. And he also had a couple of other jobs. He said Bristol also want me to do a couple of other things down there. If they can all be done at the same time, he would be delighted to do it. So we arranged a date, and we set up the studios ready. We had security around for about 3 days before he was due to arrive, closing off areas of the BBC. Then you got the smell of paint, which you generally do when royals are coming to the BBC buildings. They probably thought that all our buildings felt the fresh paint, smelled of fresh paint. But anyway, His Royal Highness arrives by car, but only to get stuck behind a big juggernaut of Safeways, which was trying to reverse in the trade entrance of Safeways, which was just opposite Kensington House. And I think he was held up there for about a quarter of an hour. It would have been easier for him to have just got out of the car and walked over. But anyway, we greeted him and we had a nice chat. It was really quite a friendly afternoon. Photographs were taken, although he did question what the need was of taking photographs. We sorted him out and sat him down in the studio, and off he went. He recorded the Old Man of Lochnagar in one take, very professionally, did the other bits and pieces. During that time, there was the rattling of the tea trolley coming down the corridor. As you know, that's what it used to be like in the BBC. And we just about stopped the tea lady from interrupting the recording by going into the studio to deliver the plate of biscuits and the royal cuppa to him. But it was a very jolly afternoon, actually. That was good fun. And,
now tell me, if you were dealing with the Queen's speech, for example, how did that get to the Commonwealth countries? It wasn't all just broadcast live, was it?
No, it wasn't. In the early days, obviously it was recorded by events or it was a TV and a radio event, of course, and we had access to the master tape, which we again made a lacquer from, and then processed it and pressed so many copies of records, put them in their sleeves, and well, we didn't put them, the factories did. They were delivered to us, and then we labelled them up and sent them off to the various Commonwealth and other countries around the world. We did that very quietly without anyone realising where these things, how they got there and where they came from.
So was this recorded by her in advance? Because always the Queen's speech was supposedly live, wasn't it, on Christmas Day? Did she do it beforehand for you?
Oh, well, not just for us, but for the BBC generally.
Really?
The film that we used to see on Christmas Day and the sound that we heard on Radio 4 or any other station were all pre-recorded. Oh, yes, they were. And
we always thought they were live. Interesting.
I don't know if it was intended to give that impression, but certainly they were pre-recorded. Otherwise, it would have been impossible for us to have been able to supply recordings, even by plane. But even by plane, they wouldn't have got to the venues in time if it were a live event.
Yeah.
Another occasion when we had some involvement with the Royals was when I went back to Enterprises after my stint in BBC Records and also in BBC Transcription Service, which was part of the World Service, I think I said. I got involved in clearing the copyright in the programme that Eddie Mertzoff made in celebration of the Queen's Jubilee year. We had to clear copyright and get permissions from the palace, of course. It all went smoothly. We were sent to various departments and made sure that all the pictures and everything were clearable. And then soon after the programme was ready to go out, all those that had worked on the programme received invitations to go to a little reception at the Buckingham Palace, which was a very great surprise, but very welcome. So we went to the smallish room in the ground floor of the Buckingham Palace. It was pretty filled. There was probably about 50 people there. We were told not to expect the Queen because it was just a reception to thank everyone. She did know that people were coming to the palace and to have a drink and a little bite to eat. And then, lo and behold, the door opened, there was a great hush, and the Queen appeared, smiling as ever. And she went round to every person in that room and spoke to them. And she was the most charming person. And I had a conversation with her, and it led to what happens to all that footage that's not used in the programme. And I said rather jokingly, hoping that was going to be taken as a joke, well, ma'am, it ends up in a programme called You've Been Framed. and she looked at me, I stared, and she chuckled away and then carried on talking about other things. And so I don't think she was offended, because I think she would have walked away otherwise.
Yes. Was the Duke with her? Because
no,
he
the
was
Duke
usually following on behind, making jokes.
Yes, no, the Duke wasn't involved in that on that occasion.
Right.
I did have one other encounter with the Prince Charles. In the record business, they have an annual event that supports the Duke of Edinburgh's award. We had a concert in the Dominion Theatre. Well, I say we, the British phonographic industry and the BPI organised it, and Prince Charles and Princess Diana attended it. The big name on the card was Duran Duran, who was they were favourites of Diana's. We were sitting quite near the royal box at the time, and then in the interval, where certain people were lined up and into a sort of double line so that they could walk down and thank people. And although I wasn't one of the nominated people, I had a tie on which had a little lion on, which was the BBC Lion, which which BBC Enterprises had copied and put on various merchandise, and one of them was the tie. And he flicked my tie and he said, "Oh, I see you're probably from the Egg Marketing Board." And because I think that the Egg Marketing Board apparently used the lion as a logo of theirs as promotion.
Yes, eggs were stamped with them, weren't they?
Yes, I think so. Well, that's right. So he's quite observant to notice that I'd got this blue tie with the gold lions on, which emanated from the BBC logo, coat of arms, in fact.
Now, what about the royal wedding? And presumably copies of that were circulated.
That was an amazing event, actually. We set ourselves almost an impossible task of saying there's no point in issuing a record, 6 weeks after the event, because people would have lost the interest, and particularly as you couldn't get access to any tapes anyway because it was going out live. So the only way we could even think of doing this was to try and copy the recording and get it out the next day. So we set out a plan which we thought would work. The record business, the record process is so slow, Right from the beginning, you've got to prepare the sleeve notes, have them printed, have them stockpiled ready to print the records so that the records then can go into the sleeves. And it's a fairly slow process of proofing and checking. We surmounted this problem by having fairly close liaison with the Palace and St Paul's Cathedral to have access to the wedding service, a copy of the wedding service and the hymns and readings and everything, so that we could print that. And also there were some earlier photograph sessions which the BBC had organised. Well, I don't think it was necessarily the BBC, it was probably organised by the Palace, which we had access to, and we used all that material to prepare the sleeves, which normally takes a minimum of 6 weeks to print and have ready. We had them ready in the factories waiting for the records to be inserted into them about 3 or 4 days before the wedding actually happened. On the day of the wedding, we produced our own master tape. We'd negotiated with 3 factories around the west part of London to prepare the pressings. There's a chemical process of actually producing stampers for records, and you have to they have to go into a bath. The lacquer has to go in the bath to grow a silver coating on it. And it's like silver plate, I suppose, like a plating mechanism. And then from that, they produce the stampers for the records. So all that has to go on before you can even put a stamper on the equipment to start making records. Anyway, it all happened. We delivered the tapes to 3 factories. The masters were made, the stampers were made, the records were made, the records went into the sleeves, and by dawn we had our first deliveries up and down Oxford Street and around that area.
The following day?
The following day, which
Amazing.
was quite an achievement, actually. And I can witness it because I went to Selfridges that very day after the wedding, and there they were, all pressed up and shiningly displayed in the centre piece of the record department.
Yeah. Now, you moved at some stage, didn't you, to Villiers House, where I worked, and it was above the station. It was always said it was for people who were making programmes above their station, as it were. But you remember that quite well. The trains used to rattle around underneath, shake the building.
Yes, that's right, yes. I don't know if further education were already in there and schools, or whether we arrived afterwards. But anyway, we did share the building with those 2 departments. And I'm pleased to say it had a lovely club and also a very good restaurant. And it was extremely nice in Ealing, and we enjoyed ourselves. The only trouble is that with enterprises, it constantly needed contact with programme departments. And that was one of the drawbacks. It wasn't working in the same buildings as, say, drama or
No.
light entertainment or sports. And it was, you need that constant involvement. So there was a lot of travelling. And of course, the Central Line always got the reputation of being the BBC line, because
Yes.
right from Bush House at Holborn all the way through down to Ealing, the Central Line provided the form of transport for BBC working people.
How much did you get abroad?
Quite a bit, actually, in the early days. Well, I say when I joined Enterprises, because we were keen to build up contacts with overseas. I went to the States probably 20 or 30 times to various events, various meetings. They were very fond of trade events in America. You couldn't get by without going to 3 or 4 a year out there. And also we had our own customers. We had stations to deal with as well. We had other record companies that I dealt with personally out there, because we were always trying to sell BBC records, for example, to overseas countries. The type of recordings we were issuing weren't that universal. We were able to shift a few in America, but quite a few in Australia and New Zealand, as you might expect. Even in places like Hong Kong and Singapore, we sold quite a few records.
But you were going out there entirely to dealing with commercial sales of records and so on. You weren't dealing with programs. You weren't.
Partly I was, when I was
Right.
in my 2 lives of Enterprises. BBC Records were part of Enterprises anyway, but before I went to BBC Records, I was involved in the negotiations with quite big deals, especially with distributors out there like Time Life, you probably will remember, in America, and they used to call meetings at the drop of a hat and expect you to jump on a Boeing 747 or even better, if you can get onto Concorde, they expected you to be there. Those sort of alliances didn't last that... Well, they did last quite a long time, but they weren't that successful, and this is why the BBC have built up its own organisational structure in America now.
Well, I suppose it's BBC Studios, is it? Sort of organisation in America.
Yes, that's right. BBC Studios have been... It's the name gives you the wrong impression. BBC Studios sounds as though it's just making programmes, but now it is. It is the controlling all the commercial activities of the BBC. It is vast, a very vast size. The present Director General, of course, was Chief Executive at one point of BBC Enterprises or Worldwide, or whichever name you choose to mention.
Yes, I think it's a surprise to a lot of people that virtually the whole of television production is as it were commercialised now, isn't it?
I think that really goes right back to the days when I think it goes back to the Margaret Thatcher days, when there was government of the day that said that there ought to be at least a 25% input of independent producers to, and the BBC had to give up, say, 25% of its production to outside organisations. And that's just grown. That really has grown quite a bit. I think in radio even more so, because nearly every time I listen to something on the radio, it's been made by an outside production company.
You dealt with the BBC Finance, as it were, in the old days pre-Bert. I mean, I suppose you can just divide things up as to pre-Bert and post-Bert, really, because he introduced the internal market and the idea of producers having the choice, in quotes, of going outside and using external resources and so on. And of course that really put the nail in the coffin of BBC engineering and BBC production resources, really.
Yes. Yeah, because
Did it affect you much when producer choice came in?
No, it didn't really, because we used sound studios in Broadcasting House and the local area. That was never, we never got affected with that. We never used to pay for them directly. They used to be charged on this awful terminology of shared services. When I was in BBC Records and we used BBC studios, sound studios, it wasn't part of that total costing that television had to take on.
No, quite. So how much do you think the BBC's changed since you joined? I mean, you said it was very formal when you joined. It then went very informal, but it was still a corporation. It was still a group of people working for the same organisation. And now, of course, it's very casualised, isn't it?
Yes.
How does it feel now?
I think it's all a change of the times, really, and because of the concern about security that the BBC have had to make so many changes and tighten down. In the earlier days, you could just walk into any BBC building and take your family and have lunch or go into the club without any problem at all. Now, even if you're a member of staff, you have to show badges or you have to get through. And if you're just a pensioner, as you know, it's been an uphill struggle to get the BBC even to accept us. So that's been forced on us. So unfortunately, that is a big difference. It's the freedom that we used to have and then the restrictions that we have now. The other thing is the big changes in offices or working areas where you're lucky if you have a desk or a seat. You know, we've had a taste of that when we've been to BBC pension meetings where it's been very difficult to book rooms, etc.
Yes.
And it's very, very tricky now. I don't think I'd like to be working at the BBC now, though I'm still proud of it.
Yes, quite. So, a very long career.
Yeah, 44 years. And
a
you
man
know,
and
I'll
boy,
tell
I
you
mean,
something funny. My birthday is on the 5th of August.
Yes.
I joined on the 8th of August. When it came to me joining BBC pension scheme, which you couldn't until you were 21, in fact, I didn't even want to join it at 21 because it meant paying out quite a lot of money. But when you're that age, you're not interested in pensions, are you?
No.
But, you know, in order that I could get a full pension, I had to pay 3 days extra. My percentage of 7.5% of whatever it was 7.5 point something to buy those 3 days so that I could get a complete 40 years pension.
Well done. There aren't many people who can say they've got a 40-year pension, the BBC pension too. Pretty lucky.
Yes.
Alan, is there anything more you'd like to say, Alan, about any aspects of what you did? Are there any reminiscences you want to insert earlier or add at the end?
I'm not a starstruck person, but you know, I met quite a lot of stars that they've all been pleased with us as well, because in the enterprises we've made the stars money as well, because the money is not just going to the BBC; they're getting paid for it as well.
Any particular stars you remember?
Of the era of comedy, I suppose, when the BBC and the highlights of Morecambe and Wise and the two Ronnies. I remember we were having some celebration of a record being released. The record industry is full of celebrations for records. They always start off that way anyway,
yes.
and then there are a few celebrations for those records that have succeeded, but not nearly as many. But we used to have quite a lot of them, and I don't know why this was, in the Martini rooms at the top of New Zealand House in the Haymarket. It was a place where you could hire, and it was an attractive place to hire, overlooked that part of London. And I remember Eric Morecambe coming up to me and saying, "Well, who are you, sir?" You know, so I'd already done a little speech and welcoming people. And he said, "Your name?" So I said, "Alan Bilyard." He said, "Bilyard?" He said, "Oh, we've got one of your tables in our snooker room." Difficult ones that we had. I don't know whether I should be saying this in the programme, but we always had trouble contacting Spike Milligan. And the only way we could ever get him to
Yes.
sign anything was to slide things under his door in his flat in Maida Vale. And then 2 or 3 weeks later, you might get a reply. We might want to be doing a recording, or we might want him to sign a bit of paper saying we can use a piece of material of his. And it took ages for doing things like that. And,
Yes.
but
you sold a lot of Goon Show tapes and things like that, didn't you?
Yes,
And
yes. You know, the Goon shows are still being heard in Australia, and
well, so do we
including
on BBC on 4 Extra, of course.
oh yes, of course you can get them.
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Anything else as a PS, a tail end?
No, I don't think so.
Not
I
a
think
tail
it was quite nice that I joined the BBC Pensioners Association, because it keeps you in touch with what's going on. Yeah, I'm still quite pleased to be involved in the BBC.
And you're
in
an
some way or
incredibly
other.
valued member of the committee, Alan. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you. You're welcome.